Hi, and welcome to the Web Performance Working Group. Today we have an exciting, I don't know, I'm excited. Noam Rosenthal. We actually have several Noams. Noam Rosenthal will present his learnings from optimizing a preview pop-up at Wikipedia. And then if we'll have time after that, we'll talk a bit about a few issues that we have that has been piling up. Generally, for the next call is scheduled for December 3rd, the usual time, not this time. Apologies for the mix-up with scheduling, but yeah. Yeah, if there is a significant scheduling problem related to that, please let me know and we'll try to figure out an alternative time. And with that out the way, Noam, do you want to get started?
Yes. First of all, I put in the presentation link. It was also in the agenda. It has a lot of links to specs and to Wikipedia and stuff. So then you can actually click the link and see what's going on. Here, present now. Not my unfinished blog. Okay. A tab. This one. Okay. Wait. Can everybody see this okay?
Yep.
Great.
That's great.
Okay, so short introduction about myself. I'm a freelance web platform person. I work on the web platform for whoever. In this case, I'm working with Wikipedia. And this was a very interesting project because it was between browser development and web development. I contribute to WebKit and Chromium, and I also do actual web work. So in this case, the project was to take a very popular use web item, which is the preview pop-ups.
Hey, Noam.
Yes.
Noam, sorry to interrupt. I think your mic is touching your sweater, and so it makes some static.
Oh, actually, the mic is the camera. All right. Yeah, let me know if there's interruptions again. So the idea here was a little bit open-ended. Was to look at an existing popular web feature, which is the Wikipedia preview pop-ups, and not just analyze and optimize them, but also find out what's missing in the web platform in order to make this easier in the future. They might be planning more pop-up-like features. Every time there's a new pop-up, not just for Wikipedia, I experienced that's also at Wix and at other companies. Every time there are those slightly off UI concepts like popovers, there's lots of performance problems, there's lots of ways to author it which are non-standard. And it ends up being not easy. So it was more like a research into what the web platform could provide to make this easier in the future and to make it easier for web developers to make fast UI in terms of jaggedness, etc. Get it going. Last one. Okay, so this is how the preview pop-ups look. You probably most of all of you are using or you have used Wikipedia. When you hover or focus on a link, you see a little balloon which appears somewhere close to the link and shows a preview of the next page with a snippet of text, a little thumbnail, and a settings button. That's about it. There's a link here for the extension. It's all open source, and you can look at the whole code of what it does and how it was built, etc. Nice thing with working with VideoWiki. Now, I see it in a lot of web projects is that it's not, there's always like a lot of little UI product definitions. For example, if you can see here, the shape of the balloon clips the image just a little bit. Like the little cursor above the anteater is in the shape of the, is still showing the color from the image. If you try to use those pop-ups for real, you'll see that when you hover a link, the cursor appears close to where you hovered, close to the mouse. It's not just centered with the link. It actually, for example, if a link is split into two lines, it will appear close to where the line the mouse was, and the cursor will appear close to the mouse. The placement would be based on the viewport. So if the link is closer to the bottom of the viewport, the pop-up will appear on top of the link. Otherwise, it will appear on the bottom of the link. Same with right or left. And the tricky and important thing is that it appears on top of navigation elements. Like there's a nav bar to the left of Wikipedia, and the pop-up should appear on top of it, but the text shouldn't. So really, with building something like this, and I went into this with existing code, but I analyzed it. I pretty much tried to rewrite it several times so that I would run into the same issues. So there are issues. The main issue is with placement and stacking. The other one is with clipping and overriding default behavior and miscellaneous. I'll get to all of them. So there's a big dilemma with stacking versus placement. This is actually the biggest issue I found here. One option was to put the pop-up as a child of the link. Like if you see here, there's the cutout link anteaters, and then the pop-up is above it. Now, the way I would think to do this is that anteaters would become position relative, and then the pop-up would have something like bottom 0 with position absolute and would just appear on top of it. I almost got that done, and it was great. But then there's the issue of stacking context. The whole general text in Wikipedia has an isolated stacking context, has a z-index. For practical purposes, you could have had the isolate CSS property. So if I was using the position relative absolute, if you see the nav bar to the left, it would hide the pop-up, which is not what I want. So the other option would to put the pop-up out of the tree, which would mean measuring and trashing. It would mean that I would have to call something like get client recs or offset left. It doesn't really matter. On the link of anteaters, and then use positioning from the page on a totally separate element, which is the pop-up. Now, what I found is that Well, it's not exactly something I found. Something that's known in the internet for many years is layout thrashing. But what I found is that layout thrashing is almost unavoidable. It's very difficult to make layout thrashing completely go away when you have to measure something at all. That's because from the time you hover over the link until the time you measure, many things can happen. There could be a scroll by the time JavaScript receives the event. There could be that something changed due to the hover pseudo class. So by the time you call get bounding client recs or whatever it is, even if it's very, very early, you could already be layout thrashing. And when I was profiling this particular pop-up preview in Wikipedia, that's what I saw. A whole bunch of layout thrashing being the main source of jaggedness. And even by batching all of the measurements together, there's still some of it because it's not entirely avoidable. Now, I looked for solutions in the internet. I found something called the top layer research, which I started joining into that conversation. I think it's a very important conversation about finding a way to separate the stacking context from the regular DOM tree in certain situations. It's kind of complex to do that, but I think it's an important conversation to push through with. If I look at the statistics, there's a library called PopperJS, which tries to solve exactly this problem. Find a way to position a pop-up relative to another element. It has a lot of synchronous get bounding client rec style things inside, which would mean in many cases it would layout thrash. So there is the top layer research. There's another standard proposal, which I don't like as much, but it is simpler, which is the relative to position, which allows positioning an element relative to another out of tree element. And now, as I said in the slide, PopperJS is used by 3% of websites. That's because it's part of Bootstrap. Positioning pop-ups is extremely popular and something that a lot of people either use Popper or Tether or one of those libraries or roll their own, like Wikipedia. And is a cause of a lot of pitfalls with performance. Another thing I found while doing this is that I try to use the standard offset X from mouse event to figure out exactly where to position the cursor. And what I found is that offset X and offset Y for that purpose are bored. They have old bugs. Firefox does completely different things from Chromium and Safari. Firefox is actually pretty spec compliant. And both people in Chromium and in WebKit were reluctant to move forward with fixing it because it's not clear whether it's whether people are relying on the bugs. The funny thing is that we can't really even tell with use counter because old versions of jQuery spike the use counter up to 50%. Like 50% of websites use offset X, but only because they use an old version of jQuery. So it's another thing I learned about use counter is that sometimes it just finds you an old jQuery bug, which in this case doesn't really affect the issue. So one big thing I learned, the only way to totally remove thrashing, it's not just layout thrashing, it's also style thrashing. It's style calculation that can happen without paint. just because you need to get some measurements. The only way to totally remove it is to totally remove synchronous measurements. Batching them together reduces them, but does not remove them.
So maybe a question on that. Would asynchronous measurement help here? So if you had a promise that would return at some point with the measurement at the browser's convenience, would that have helped you, or would that have been too late from a responsiveness perspective?
I think in this case, it would make it would help, but would not be optimal. The problem is that when you use one-time measurements, like you have to remeasure them if there is a scroll or if something in the page changes.
Yeah.
I guess if you had something like resize observer, but for position, it would be one solution. So the answer is yes. Synchronous measurements like resize observer that also worked on coordinates and not just sides would help.
Okay.
It's not, yeah.
Yeah, an intersection observer is not exactly.
No, it doesn't help here. It
Yeah.
doesn't. It doesn't tell you where an element is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I believe this might be a good intermediate solution to have a position observer. I went more with let's try to solve pop-ups, more like in the CSS and HTML realm. But I think both are legitimate. The other one was clipping. So the old or the existing Wikipedia code uses SVG, which makes a lot of sense since I11 still exists and Wikipedia still supports it. And it's, even though it's 2020, that's still the situation. But when I tried to replace it with the more modern clip path, I found that it's very subtle, but this balloon has rounded corners of two pixel radius. And with clip path, polygons don't have rounded corners. And pathlets use only absolute coordinates. So you cannot make a responsive balloon with clip path. Now, for the purpose of this project, I was able to mimic the same behavior with Polygon just because it's a two pixel radius, so I just did it with a straight line. However, it wouldn't scale for pop-ups in general. So I'm now working on a new shape syntax, which allows responsive shapes in a clip path and in shape outside, anything that takes shape. I'm actually pretty excited with this. I'm working with the CSS working group in this. And as part of this work, I contributed the clip path with the path syntax to Chrome, but it wouldn't help because it's not responsive. The other thing I found is the overriding default behavior. What I mean by that, many times links have the title attribute, and hovering over them would show the original, the title attribute as an OS tooltip. If you have a web-based tooltip, those two would not work well together. UI-wise, like the pretty bad drawing I did. So what was happening in the Wikipedia code is that when hover happens, JavaScript removes the title attribute and reinstates it when the pop-up is hidden. Now that code also appeared in a profiler. You change the DOM, there's a new style calculation, maybe something relies on the title attribute, even just for calculations that don't end up doing any layout or any painting. It ends up being pretty expensive. I checked to see how much the web is doing this in practice, and I found that Bootstrap tooltips do this. You hover over a link to show a pop-up, and it internally removes the title attribute on hover. What I would expect to happen is that prevent default on the mouse over, or this is a suggestion, that when you prevent the default on mouse over or mouse enter or something like that, the OS will just not show the tooltip. The problem is that prevent default is not standard. Prevent default, the standard for prevent default just says the browser should prevent the default behavior. It doesn't say what the default behavior is. So it's up to every browser. So pursuing this is something I'm planning to do, but it's not standard work. It's just convincing WebKit folks and Chromium folks and Firefox folks that this is the right thing. Maybe it isn't.
So is any browser doing the right thing, or what you would think is the right thing on prevent default here? No.
Nobody is preventing default on mouse over. Prevent default on mouse over currently. I need to check some of the more edge cases in Firefox. I would put myself a note to do that. But browsers today don't do anything to prevent default on mouse over. It doesn't do anything.
Yeah. One could argue that it's not like, on the one hand, the spec doesn't necessarily need to define what the default behavior is, but it could be an implementation bug on all three.
Yeah. And one could think that because the websites are built with the prevent default behavior in mind, like this exact line code that I put in the link. So maybe it should be standard. Otherwise, it's kind of hard. Otherwise, there is code that just relies on how browsers happen to work, which is what standards are there to prevent. So anyway, by the way, if anybody else has questions while I'm speaking, please interrupt me like Gavi is doing. It's great to have a conversation.
Okay, maybe I'll interrupt.
Yes.
The other non. From what I remember, I might be incorrect here. Titles are not considered. I mean, tooltips in general, which are usually implemented with title, but sometimes they implemented using JavaScript, are not considered accessible from accessibility standards and regulation.
Right.
Is that something you want to keep? Do you want to keep those tooltips, or discourage them typically?
I think they are an augmentation. Also, those preview pop-ups are not exactly accessible. You can't reach them with a focus.
That would have been my next question. But
yeah, you can reach them with focus, but they're ARIA hidden in Wikipedia.
Oh, I see.
If you continue your thread of that they're an augmentation, they're pulling from content that the link is ultimately referencing. So it's not like the content that is inside of them is not accessible. It's a navigation away versus a tab.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think titles in general, I think that there are opinions to discourage them. I think MediaWiki as a platform, I don't speak for them here because I'm just analyzing this, allows this augmentation. Like when the pop-up previews are not available, then title should work. This tooltip. I think it's okay as long as the content is accessible. It's okay to have a title that does something, but the analysis here is not opinionated about this. Seeing Bootstrap and seeing Wikipedia, titles are still widely used.
Yeah, good.
Okay. So I branched out my work. One of them was to find the suboptimal but viable solutions. What web developers do every day when they have to work around browser features, the current state of browsers. Like, what can I do with the current code that would work and would be faster? So the first thing I was doing is perform all the measurements right in the beginning. The first thing that happens when the event comes, I measure whatever I need to measure right away. That prevents 90% of layout and style thrashing. It leaves them to edge cases, which is nice. Still, I need to use get client recs. Get client recs does way too many things. And it has to calculate all the transforms. It has to find all the little links. All I really care about is the hit rect of my mouse event. It's really the only thing I care about, and the browser already knows it. But still, I have to call get client recs, which can take milliseconds, or over a course of a few calls can take milliseconds. It's not a very scalable function based on all the things it has to do internally. I'm using a polygon with semi-rounded corners, which works for this UI, but if the Wikipedia designer would want to do a rounder rectangle, they wouldn't be able to use a solution. And currently, when the pop-ups extension initializes, it just removes all the title attributes so that they don't have to be removed on hover. You can see all those optimizations in this link. Also, there's going to be a blog post about all this pretty soon. There's still an anti-iter tooltip that was left in the previous slide. But you can see all the code and what I did there. So these are my feature requests from the web platform, which I'm also pursuing on my other hat as a web platform developer. The peoples want a solution for pop hovers, something that allows me to have something that floats over, but is still relative somehow, both with accessibility, both with positioning, both with linking to the original element. I call it stacking versus placement. There's a link in one of the other slides. I want that conversation to wake up about popovers. Second one, fixing offset X and offset Y, either with some backwards compatibility flag or just by breaking the buggy behavior in Blink and WebKit, and working through backwards compatibility. Third is the flexible shape for clip path. There's not really blockers for that, just to make it happen. The fourth one is prevent default from mouse over. And my main takeaway to this group maybe is that performance is not just about monitoring or about meta and HTTP and things like that. Sometimes performance is about fixing bugs and allowing new forms of expression. Like sometimes a performance bottleneck is just a bug workaround, which could be a spec bug, it could be an implementation bug, or a workaround for a form of expression that's missing, like trying to position a pop-up because there is no standard form of expression for pop-ups. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. One final question about the offset X and Y compatibility issues. So you're saying that currently we have different behavior for Firefox versus WebKit and Chromium? That's
Correct.
And do we have breakage reported by Firefox related to that different behavior? Or is that just from a...
There are people complaining about it. There are all the bugs open about all this.
Okay.
And mainly people just not using offsetX. The Stack Overflow, when you search Stack Overflow for offsetX, etc., you get oh, forget this, just use get bounding client rect.
Okay.
By the way, Stack Overflow says it about many things, and that's what many developers do. Like they don't have a solution, so they measure synchronously, causing performance bottlenecks.
Yeah.
Would using so I'm
Right.
just asking, would using a mutation observer would help here if you measure it and then track if it has changed, and then if not, use the original positioning?
You still need to measure the original position somehow. You would need something like the resize observer, like geometry observer. But also that, or just one, or doing one asynchronous measurement would also help. But at least wouldn't block the thread. But mutation, no, mutation observers also, they don't consider scrolling and they don't consider change images loading and font loading. So they can't really be a reliable source of geometry.
Yeah, well, you need to correlate it with an intersection observer and then correlate the events and then get that. It becomes a heuristic.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments?
My main comment would be that for this particular type of feature, it shows how difficult it is to do the right thing and how easy it is to do the bad thing, as in people using these expensive JavaScript functions have no idea what they're doing. And we constantly have to tell people who write code at our organization when we do performance reviews, please stop using that. But then you run into situations like this where even if you say, please stop using that, they have no other choice. And yeah, it shows how things are, in terms of ergonomics, really the opposite of what they should be. Like the easy functions to use are the ones you want to avoid. And doing it properly is just like super complicated with lots of very advanced CSS and JavaScript knowledge required to do it properly. So to me, this screams for there needs to be a much simpler solution to do the right thing. And maybe we should also warn people more about those very expensive JavaScript functions that get used willy-nilly, and people have no idea that it's causing those issues.
Yeah, or alternatively, like what I can imagine us doing, us as the web platform at large, but we could, assuming we fix those things, people will still not necessarily adopt the fix, but then we could PR those fixes to those libraries and make them significantly more performant, potentially.
I think that library developers want to do the right thing. Like when I found the old jQuery bug with offset X, I found a later commit in jQuery that fixed it.
Okay.
That it actually said don't call offset X to avoid layout and style thrashing. It's I think people want to do the right thing. Like if we should enable.
Yeah. Cool. So I guess a follow-up question would be, like, first of all, like on this, just amazing work. You filed bugs on everything, and we should tell people, like, most or all of those things are not things that this working group can solve, but we can probably, you know, yell at people until they would. But beyond that, like, what other low-hanging fruit is there out there? Like, how can we systematically weed out those pieces that are causing all those rendering performance issues or other, performance issues?
I think going back to the performance group, back to this group, apart from being advocates and having a wider knowledge and conversation with the other groups, I would say that measuring and alerting about layout thrashing and about synchronous measurement could help. Like maybe even a performance entry for that. Like whenever there is a style calculation or a layout that didn't come from painting, this is something should always be a yellow flag, and it should go both to the other working groups and to the web developer.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think this is like, it's flagged in DevTools and some modes, but not in the wild. And this kind of measurement is highly dependent on user interaction, so it's very easy to miss in the lab.
Yep.
That's a great point.
Also, I think the rule of thumb I found here is you have a performance review of a website, start of jaggedness, start just by looking for get bounding client rect. Like it's like a smoke. I just found it to be a smoking gun in many situations. So you just watch the detective movie I'm using, like.
Yeah. So you're saying we should strive to find an async, like. The part that I'm having trouble with is, whether like a different asynchronous API would be 100% replacement, or will there still be cases where
it will be immediate.
Correct is needed, and
it's an API that might get called a lot. That's the thing. Trying to synchronize position with JavaScript it would become less expensive than it is, but it wouldn't be a solution. The solution would be that you position the pop-up that is placed relatively to another element and is stacked with the whole page.
Yeah.
And there are several solutions to that, but and then you can just let the compositor, layout system, whatever, deal with it. Any other solution would require JavaScript on scroll and other things.
Cool. Any other questions?
Hey, I was just curious about what Gil said about JavaScript libraries that are easy to use doing the wrong things. Can we point fingers and name names here?
I think I did in the in the presentation, both Popper and Bootstrap. They're doing the wrong thing, not because they're not trying, but because there's no other solution. In Bootstrap, it's setting the title on hover, and in Popper, it's get bounding client rect to position something.
Yeah, so I think the right order here would be, create a reasonable alternative, then ask them to move to it or PR a solution, and then if they somehow don't, or if people are using the older version that's not great, that is where you point fingers. Does that make sense? Cool. Any other questions? Cool. So thank you so much. And yeah, and let's then we can talk about some of the issues that we have on the agenda in the 15 minutes we have left. The first one we have is resource or navigation timing, issue number 124. Titled "What should transfer size and all the other sizes blah 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 should be for navigation and resource timing when the service worker is involved." So it turns out that currently they are all returning 0 when a service worker is involved, which is probably not what we want them to. And then there's a discussion on the issue regarding what they should be returning and how we can specify that. And I think like on the issue, we mostly the issue coalesced on them returning values that are as close as possible to the actual transferred sizes, because responses currently, the response body has, in fetch, has equivalents to the encoded and decoded body sizes. It doesn't have an equivalent to the transfer size or the header sizes, but we could probably specify that. And then when a service worker is putting together resources from various response elements or from like typically from a single response object, not element, that would, we could take those values and report them. And I guess the question to the group is, does this make sense for everyone? Anyone has any objections or alternative ideas as to what we want to report in those cases? Okay. Yeah, so from my perspective, this, like, the proposal on the issue makes general sense. And the main thing that scares me here is the fetch integration pieces, because right now we are not, like, we will need resource timing to operate on a response object in order to make use of those response parameters. But at the same time, we could maybe, make that piece work. Hopefully it won't have to wait for full fetch integration, but yeah,
Do you have a sense what browsers doing? What browsers are doing right now?
I think
Or are we just the only ones? Is Chrome the only one implementing the sizes? Because Apple isn't, right?
Apple isn't. So in WebKit, sizes is not implemented. I believe that Firefox does have the transfer size implemented.
Right. So it would be good to know if they also have the same problem or if they're computing it more correctly.
I
believe
think
there's 0 too.
I suspect that this is how it's specified. So not although I didn't clearly look, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it would be nice to change the spec first before, because there was someone saying they want to fix it in Chromium, but I think we need to know what's the fix before. Like we don't want to just fix it in Chromium and be like, okay, Firefox, just figure it out. Like
I agree. I agree with that statement. Yeah. And it seems to me like that, like properly specifying it will require at least some fetch integration, if not full fetch integration. Yeah. Yeah, but I don't hear anyone loudly objecting to transfer size and encoded size reporting the results from the fetch response. So I think we have general agreement on what we should be doing, and now it's just a question of how can we specify it.
Can we fix this from the spec point of view to align with current fetch concepts without fixing the whole spec to align with fetch?
That's a good question. I don't have an answer on like before actually diving in. I think we could have done that if we were using the response object in some way. We are not doing that right now. So, but maybe there's a path forward to just integrate the response object into the general processing model and then report those values using that. Yeah. Okay, cool. So moving on to the next issue. Issue 21 on the performance timing primer. Sam Whaler from W3C team pointed out rightfully that the document claims to be normative, but it's mostly just documentation. And we should probably fix that. And then Shushan commented that the document is outdated and should be obsoleted, and recommending Nick's blog post instead.
I don't know about that. What is outdated as part of it? I haven't looked at it lately.
I haven't looked lately either. I think it might be worthwhile to, like, for someone to go over it and determine that. I wonder if anyone feels particularly eager to take on that task.
Is it something that we want to maintain? It looks like the last time we touched it was about 4 years ago.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, if it's out of date, then we can, like, if it's indeed out of date, then we should probably obsolete it, because we don't necessarily want to maintain it. There's also the question of, will it still be, yeah, maybe the right, like if there's a room for that kind of a document, maybe the right place for it is in MDN or web.dev or any other, developer facing venue, rather than as a W3C note.
I guess the question would be if anyone has used this document or not.
That is a good question.
Do we have any sort of analytics on it? Another question.
I don't know. But yeah, from the crowd here, has anyone used that document when you got started or at some point? Raise your hand if you did. Yeah. Yeah, so it might be, might be the right call to obsolete it, and then, maybe try to revamp something like that somewhere else. But
there's been, from the GitHub traffic analytics, there's been 3 unique visitors to this repo this month. And my guess, that's the 3 people that have commented on the issue. I'm not sure if that's the same as the people that have looked at the rendered HTML of the primer. I'm not sure, but just as a, I don't know, it's got some useful information in it. I mean, it's got a nice overview, but it's something more to maintain.
Yeah. I can ask around, like, Chrome team folks if they think this is useful or want to take on maintenance or migration or something along those lines. And yeah, if there's, the 3 unique visitors really feels like Sam, Shoshan, and me. So yeah, maybe obsoleting is the right call here. But I'll ask around and see if someone wants this to stick around. Benjamin, I believe that this is like the original motivation for this was comments from Boris related to confusion. I may be mixing things up, but if you could also ask around on the Mozilla side to see if someone finds value in this document staying, alive, that would be helpful.
Will do. I think certainly have my support to deprecate this.
Okay, thank you.
The other open issue in the repo was opened in January 2018 for Marcos, and he's proposing moving it to MDN then. So we haven't.
So you're saying maybe 2018 Marcos was right.
Possibly.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so I think we can settle on obsoleting this unless some evidence comes up that this is required. Cool. That would also probably mean that we can remove it from the charter, from the charter draft. I don't know, Karine, will this have timeline implications, or?
Probably not. I think that we can still make changes if we do those quickly. But even for this document, I don't think that we need a change to the charter.
No, just to remove it. I think it's currently a deliverable or a non-normative deliverable.
It's probably non-normative, so I think that we can remove it.
Okay.
I'll look into it. But...
Okay, cool. Thank you. And yeah, we have 1 minute left, so we can probably leave the last one for next time. Awesome. So thanks all. And I will see you all in a couple of weeks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.